Imagine yourself standing on a jagged, wind-swept cliff at Cabo de Roca, the westernmost point of continental Europe. Before you lies the vast, dark Atlantic, its powerful waves crashing against the ancient stone. Behind you, a border stretching over 1,200 kilometers separates you from Spain. According to every rule of geography and common sense, the people living together on this Iberian peninsula, sharing the same sun, the same Roman roads, and the same history of Moorish rule, should be biological twins. They share a Mediterranean climate, a passion for football, and languages with deep Latin roots. However, modern science has just delivered a shocking blow to that intuition. Large-scale genetic studies have revealed a startling truth. A person from Lisbon is often genetically closer to someone in Ireland, Scotland, or Western France than to their neighbor in Barcelona or Valencia. This sounds like a geographical error, but DNA tells a story that maps do not. Why does the map call them brothers, while the DNA claims they are strangers living in the same house? Today, we won't look at majestic castles or medieval battles for the answer. Instead, we are traveling back much further, to a time when ice covered the continent and humans huddled in caves, to understand why Portugal evolved as a genetic island in the heart of Iberia. This isn't just a story about a country. It's about how nature, climate, and time trapped the most ancient lineages of humanity in a small corner of the world, turning it into a living museum of human evolution, where every cell carries the echo of migrations from tens of thousands of years ago. To understand this divergence, we must turn back the clock 20,000 years to the last glacial maximum. At that time, the Earth was an alien world. Most of Europe was not a lush green landscape, but a white graveyard beneath ice sheets kilometers thick. Life was pushed to the edge, and our ancestors had only a few places to flee the White Death creeping down from the north. The Iberian Peninsula was the ultimate sanctuary for humanity, an oasis of warmth in a dying continent. But even within this sanctuary, nature performed a silent separation called the Atlantic Facade. While the interior of Europe was a frozen wasteland, this western coastal strip remained habitable thanks to the warm Gulf Stream currents. The oldest hunter-gatherers, the reindeer hunters and coastal foragers, chose this narrow strip of land as their final refuge. They lived in limestone caves, warming themselves by flickering fires and looking out at the only thing that wasn't frozen, the sea. When the ice began to melt around 12,000 years ago, a strange genetic phenomenon occurred. These Ice Age refugees, instead of moving deep into the Iberian interior, which was becoming dominated by new groups from the east, chose a route along the coastline, moving north. They were the pioneers who settled Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, and Ireland. This created a permanent genetic bond along the Atlantic axis, making the land of Portugal the starting point for a unique bloodline. While Central and Eastern Spain opened their doors to waves of Neolithic farmers from Central Europe and the Middle East, the narrow strip of Portugal remained a stronghold for these original prehistoric inhabitants. They preserved the genetic haplogroups of the Ice Age in their purest form. Portugal acted like a stone time capsule, looking out to sea and protecting the oldest codes of the European genome that other regions lost through constant mixing. As history moved into the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, the geographic isolation of Portugal intensified. The land is not composed of vast plains, but is guarded by steep mountains and powerful rivers. This region became the sacred ground of resilient tribes like the Lusitanians and the Galicians. They were not just fierce warriors, They were the great architects of prehistory, building thousands of megalithic monuments and giant dolmens that still dot the landscape from Alentejo to Minho today. There is a common misconception in history books that the Romans completely erased the identity of these prehistoric people when they colonized the peninsula. But DNA tells a different story. Although the Roman Empire brought the Latin language, complex laws, and straight stone roads, they never brought enough people to replace the gene pool of the locals who had adapted to this land over millennia. The Romans were mostly an administrative and military class. They were not mass migrants. In Portugal, the genetic stability from prehistory was so strong that it resisted dilution from every major migration thereafter. This means that a Portuguese person today still carries the DNA of the very stone builders from 5,000 years ago. While Spain was caught in a whirlwind of migrations from Greece, Phoenicia, and Carthage along the Mediterranean coast, the Atlantic fortress silently maintained its biological frame from the Stone Age. This biological resilience created an identity completely separate from the rest of the peninsula. It is an invisible but permanent spiritual and biological connection to their prehistoric ancestors. When you touch the ancient stones in Évora, you aren't just touching history. You are touching the traces of the people who created the genetic code flowing through the veins of the people there today. After the Roman Empire collapsed in the chaos of the 5th century, a new genetic ingredient was added to the Portuguese biological test tube through the Germanic Suebi tribe. This is a crucial detail, often forgotten by world history, overshadowed by the Visigoths. While the Visigoths dominated almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, the Suebi chose a different path. They settled and established their kingdom in the northwest, modern-day northern Portugal and Galicia, around 409 AD. For nearly 170 years, the Suebi Kingdom maintained a remarkable and separate stability. Here, they didn't just rule, they heavily intermarried with the local Lusitanian and Galaici populations. They brought traits from central Germany and Scandinavia, leaving genetic markers known as I1 and R1BU106. When compared to Spain, where Visigothic influence was spread thin over a massive area, the Germanic influence in Portugal was concentrated and dense in the north. This created a thin but distinct Nordic mask over the ancient Atlantic foundation. This explains why, in regions like Minho or the Douro, you often see locals with light hair, fair skin, and blue eyes much more frequently than in other parts of the peninsula. This wasn't an accident of nature. It was a reminder of an ancient Germanic kingdom that took root deep in the soil, creating a clear genetic distinction between the north of Portugal and the Spanish interior. The Suebi didn't just pass through, they became part of the flesh and bone of the land. One of the most controversial and misunderstood truths in Iberian genetics is the influence of the Moors from North Africa. Most people assume that because Spain, especially Andalusia, was the place where the Moors stayed the longest, they must carry the most North African DNA. However, modern DNA data presents a paradox. The percentage of North African ancestry in Portugal is often higher and more evenly distributed than in Spain. Why is this? The answer lies not in who was invaded more, but in how each country ended its Reconquista, the centuries-long war of reconquest. In Spanish history, this war was characterized by extreme exclusion. When the Christian kingdoms retook land, they implemented mass expulsions and the infamous Inquisition to completely scrub the nation's bloodline of Islamic and Jewish traces. But in Portugal, the process happened earlier and was characterized more by social integration than by expulsion. As the independent Portuguese kingdom moved south to retake Lisbon and the Algarve, they chose a different approach. Instead of expelling everyone, they allowed many Moorish and Berber communities to stay, live together, and gradually blend into the social fabric. As a result, instead of being erased, the North African bloodline silently flowed into and combined with the existing Ibero-Roman and Suebi lineages. This integration created a unique Western Mediterranean signature in southern Portugal. While Spain attempted to become a purely European entity through exclusion, Portugal became a more diverse and flexible genetic island through absorption. They turned former enemies into an inseparable part of their own veins, enriching the gene pool of the Atlantic facade. The final piece of this puzzle that locked the mystery in place is the Araya border, established in 1139. This isn't just a political boundary. It is one of the oldest and most stable borders in the entire world. For nearly 900 years, while Spanish kingdoms were merging, splitting, and fighting to form a unified nation, Portugal stood firm as a completely independent entity, looking out toward the sea. This long-term political stability turned the border into a giant biological filter. It prevented the genetic flow from the Spanish interior from flooding in and allowed the Portuguese gene pool to churn and strengthen within itself. Scientists call this genetic drift, where an isolated population gradually develops unique characteristics far removed from its original source. To see this clearly, consider the real story of two families living less than 50 kilometers apart but separated by the Minho River. On one side of the river, in Galicia, Spain, a man named Manuel might carry DNA mixed with Neolithic farmers from the European interior and traces of the Castilian Empire. But just across the river, in a small village in northern Portugal, a man named João carries DNA, connecting him deeply to the Scottish Highlands or Ireland. For João's DNA, the sea was the only road, and the Spanish continent behind him was an invisible wall. The stability of the border turned the people here into a massive extended family, preserving genetic traces of Ice Age hunters that most of Europe lost long ago. The isolated fishing communities in coastal villages like Nazaré or Peniche are the living embodiments of the sea, resilient, hardy, and almost never assimilated by any inland migrations. It proves a profound truth. A border is not just a lifeless line on a paper map. It is a living, genetic barrier that shapes the identity, appearance, and fate of an entire nation across dozens of generations. The journey to find the answer to the genetic difference between these two neighbors has taught us a great lesson about identity and survival. It shows that geography is only destiny if we allow it to be, and Portugal is proof of the power of stability and the determination to preserve the ancient amidst the chaos of history. Why do we care about these tiny strands of DNA? Because they are the most honest chronicle humanity has ever possessed. While kings can rewrite history and empires can redraw maps, DNA never lies. It records every footstep of the Ice Age refugees, every breath of the prehistoric stone builders, and the silent coexistence of cultures once thought to be rivals. The greatest lesson we receive is this: never judge a people only by their position on a map or by what you see on the surface. True diversity and the most heroic stories often lie hidden right within the spirals of the DNA strands we all inherit. Every one of us is an island, carrying the memory of thousands of years of human history, a link in an unbreakable chain from prehistory to today. The difference between the Portuguese and the Spanish is not a mistake of nature, but a masterpiece sculpted by time and selective solitude. It reminds us that sometimes turning your back on the crowd to look out at the vast ocean and persistently holding your own border is the best way to keep your soul and your unique identity in a world that is slowly being homogenized. Are you surprised that a person from Portugal is closer to someone from Ireland or France than to their neighbor next door? And have you ever wondered what prehistoric mysteries are waiting to be discovered in the blood flowing through your own veins? History is not just in books, it is in your breath and your cells. Don't forget to like and subscribe to continue these fascinating journeys back in time through the bloodline.